So, Half Man recently ended, and while there is a lot to unpack, especially around masculinity and violence, I'm less interested in focusing on only that. Not because it isn't important, but because I already did a video last year on another one of Richard Goude's works, Baby Reindeer, where I talked at length about how repression in men can feed into violence and how that violence then gets justified. So honestly, I'm fatigued. There has been so much conversation about the crisis of masculinity and men's so-called propensity for violence, and I think part of the reason we keep having the same conversation is because we refuse to name the actual culprit, patriarchy. We cannot talk about a crisis of masculinity without talking about the system that decides what masculinity is supposed to be. And more than likely, we would not have this so called male loneliness crisis if men and boys were allowed to show real care for one another, if they were allowed more opportunities to be vulnerable, if women were not treated as the only acceptable people men can openly love, need, or emotionally depend on. So, yes, men would be lonely if tenderness toward other men is treated as shameful. Men would be lonely if care is feminized and then devalued. Men would be lonely if becoming a strong masculine figure for your family or community is treated as the goal, but emotional honesty is treated as failure. And that is where Half Man becomes interesting to me. The series follows Niall and Ruben, two estranged stepbrothers, across 3 decades of their volatile relationship. We see them as teenagers, as university aged young adults, and later in adulthood. And one of the things that stood out to me is that Niall does not seem to grow up in a queer affirming household, despite having a queer mother who is in a relationship with another woman. That relationship actually is the reason Niall and Ruben become stepbrothers. Their mothers, Lori and Moira, are together. Despite that, though, like I said, his household doesn't seem queer affirming. Niall's mother still assumes he will like women, and that is not necessarily malicious, but it is telling because even as a queer woman herself, she does not initially seem to consider that her child might also be queer. Again, her initial assumption that he likes women isn't malicious, but it does come from a heteronormative place. And if a household is still operating from some kind of heteronormativity, then it is not fully queer affirming. Later, when Niall is an adult, his mother says she does not have a problem with him being gay. She has a problem with how he goes about it, referring to his cruising escapades. Now, Niall's cruising does get him into trouble several times, and later in the series, his trips to bathhouses become increasingly risky. Drugs are involved, unprotected sex is involved, so I understand his mother's concern. But the implication that there is a right way to be gay is questionable in the least. It suggests that maybe Lori sees herself as one of the good ones, an acceptable queer, maybe even the respectable kind, not a deviant like her son. And this makes Niall's conversation with Albie at university make so much more sense. When they talk about being gay, Niall says that for men it is more shameful. And given what we see from his mother later, I understand why he would feel that way. Because on top of bullying, on top of Ruben's constant jabs, even the queer adult in his life seems to carry a hierarchy of acceptable and unacceptable queerness. Despite that emotionally unsafe environment, there is still a fierce expectation of familial loyalty placed on Niall, especially as a teenager. And I found that painfully familiar because how many queer children and teenagers grow up in families where they are expected to show up, provide care, keep the peace, and be loyal while still being disrespected by the same people demanding that loyalty. Ruben consistently disrespects Niall. He's abusive to him a lot of the time, actually. Moira knows that. Lori knows that. But whenever Ruben is in crisis, Niall is expected to step in. He's expected to help Ruben study. He's expected to lie in court for him. He's expected to attend Moira's funeral, even though he never really liked her. Again and again, Niall is treated as someone whose pain is secondary to Ruben's chaos. And I want to be clear, being queer does not automatically make someone altruistic. It does not automatically make someone caring. And Niall is no saint. He does reprehensible things. He is self-destructive. He hurts people. He protects himself in ways that, you know, damages other people's lives. But Niall often does care enough to put aside his differences with people for some perceived greater good. Even when that greater good is self-serving, even when it borders on denial, even when it might be delusional, Niall is still predictable enough that people feel they can count on him. At the very least, they can count on him not to be violent. And yes, that is a low bar, but I think that is part of why Niall is perceived as more caring than he actually is. Because compared to Ruben, even basic restraint starts to look like tenderness. Still, I think there is a softness in Niall that people respond to. Maybe because growing up with shame can make you more aware of what it means to be unseen. Maybe because when you recognize that adults made you feel unsafe, you become more likely, though not guaranteed, to show up for others in ways people did not show up for you. Every queer person is different, obviously, but that is, I suppose, a generalization that I think the show is playing with. Niall has a quality people like. He makes people feel seen for some reason. This is in part why Mona, Ruben's wife, ends up being drawn to him. Yes, his niceness toward Mona is partly motivated by trying to get back at Ruben, but it does not change the fact that for a brief moment she feels safer with Niall than she does with her actual husband. Again, there is a softness to Niall, or at least a performance of softness, and people appreciate that, but they do not respect him for it. Years later, Mona has a son after that one encounter with Niall. She lies to Ruben, says the child is his. Ruben is in prison, and Niall goes to Mona's house to intimidate her into not getting back together with Ruben, because I think he feels if she does that, she'll maybe end up being more compelled to tell him the truth, but also it would just put Niall in a sticky situation if Ruben and Mona are back together, and then Niall is hanging out with them from time to time, and then Niall pretending to be the uncle to this child that's really his. Girl, mess. Anyway, Mona says she wants to get back with Ruben because she's lonely and because her son needs a strong masculine figure. Niall tells her he could be that for her son, their son, actually, and Mona basically says, "You didn't hear me, did you?" But that moment with Niall is so revealing because people like Niall when he makes them feel seen, but when it comes to who they imagine raising their sons, who they imagine leading the family, who they imagine providing structure, they will want Ruben. Obviously, I'm generalizing here, but I think it's a fair generalization. But yeah, they want a Ruben, the strong masculine figure. Even if that figure is violent, even if that figure makes everyone around him less safe. And the thing is, there are a lot of real life Monas. Strong masculine figure is often code for I want my son to grow up to be a protector. I want him to be hardened. I want him to be strong before he is kind. And if he ends up caring, that is a bonus, but it is not the priority. And that is a problem because functionally, the strong masculine men we keep rallying around do not make us safer. Many of them have been seen to harm their families, harm their communities. Many of these men do not protect anything. They create the crisis everyone else has to survive. And this is why I'm exhausted by conversations about male violence. Not because male violence is unimportant, but because we keep talking about the consequences while refusing to change the conditions that produce them. I mean, what are we doing to culturally produce men who are more caring? Not fake nice guys, not men who use softness as, a manipulation tool, but people with the actual capacity to care, people capable of emotional labor, people capable of mutuality, people capable of being needed without needing to dominate. Hi, so editing Austin here. So I realized that I think this part of the video probably started to sound a bit more blamey than I intended, but we, or rather by we, I mean the collective we. My point is not that, like, individuals consciously set out to produce men like Ruben or are individually responsible for every harmful outcome. I'm speaking more about the ways systems reproduce themselves, often through, right, like values, expectations, and ideas we absorb and participate in without fully realizing it. So the question I'm asking is less who is to blame and more how might we all, to varying degrees, participate in maintaining the conditions that continue to produce men like Ruben. I hope that clarifies things. More Rubens will keep being produced as long as we prioritize raising strong masculine figures devoid of care. If we raised children across genders to value kindness, vulnerability, collaboration, and mutual aid without making them terrified of failing at some gender performance, we would understand relationships differently. Romantic relationships, platonic relationships, family, community, all of it. And, that begins with queer liberation. It begins with dismantling cis heteronormative patriarchy. Because the fantasy of the system is that if we raise enough strong men, eventually we will produce benevolent patriarchs, men who are powerful but gentle, dominant but fair, protective but not controlling. Strong enough to save us, but somehow not strong enough to hurt us. And that is a lie. Because when you consolidate strength in one section of the population, you teach that section that strength belongs to them, that leadership belongs to them, that protection belongs to them, that everyone else is supposed to need them. And when those men inevitably cannot live up to the impossible ideal of the benevolent patriarch, what do we get? We get Ruben again and again and again, not because Ruben is an accident, but because Ruben is the system working exactly as designed, and the rest of us are expected to call it tragedy after we already helped build the conditions that made him possible.